So the final section in this area talking about platform as a service is we're going to be talking about function apps. Now function apps have two styles within Microsoft Azure. We're going to get into that in a second, but we're going to talk about them as an app service at the moment. So I'm going to give it a name, new function. Again, it's fully qualified.azurewebsites.net. Goes on my normal subscription. I can create it as a new resource group or add it to my existing resource group. It's up to you. Now, similar to web apps, you do have the option of Windows or Linux in the operating system. Now, the key feature that makes function apps a little bit different is you have the choice. You can have the choice of running your function as part of an app service plan. You see, we can just add it just like we can to our web apps, API apps, mobile apps to our existing app service plan or create a new app service plan. We also have the option to run it serverless. So you may have heard of this term serverless. Functions can run in a consumption model, which means you only get charged for each time that they run. There's a per execution charge. There's also a per CPU, total CPU usage charge as well. So there's two charges for consumption plan. There is a very generous free option for consumption plan. So just like you can have a free web app, you can also have free functions running under the consumption model. So I think it's 1 million executions of your function that you don't get charged for. Let's run it under our app service plan. Now, because of our choice of operating system, we get the choices of .NET, JavaScript, and Java. If we were to choose the Linux option, again, we can choose it under an app service plan. Now, we can't mix our Windows app service plan with our Windows app service plan with a Linux function, so we would have to create a new app service plan. But you'll notice that we get .NET, JavaScript, and Python as the options, okay, as opposed to .NET, JavaScript, and Java. So there's slightly different options depending on your operating system. Now, functions need a storage account to operate. So you're going to be creating not only function files, but the configuration files for your function. And so you're going to have to either create a new storage account or use one of your existing storage account. And just like web apps, you have the option of enabling application insights. So let's hit the create button. So the container that holds our functions was created fairly quickly, but we still haven't actually created any function code. Now, a function is intended to be short pieces of code that can actually be created, developed, tested right within the Azure portal. So unlike web apps where you need to develop them outside of Azure and then upload them and deploy them, you could very well create a small function right within the portal interface here. So we've got 0 functions at the current time. Let's hit the plus here and create our first function. Now, there are a few ways to create functions. Microsoft provides some templates that we can borrow from, or we can create them from scratch. You'll see here that it's even giving us a choice of our development environment, whether we want to develop functions in Visual Studio or VS Code or any other editor, including a notepad or a text editor. Or if we want to use the in-portal function to create. Let's choose the in-portal function to demonstrate. Now, we do have a number of templates. The two most common ones are a webhook, which means it will have a public URL, and if any application calls that URL, that will trigger the function to run. Or we can have the function run on a timer, so every 30 minutes, every hour, however often we want, this function can run. And then we can view there's a bunch of other templates. For instance, if a blob gets created or an entry goes into a queue, etc. Let's look at the other templates. So there are probably just over a dozen basic templates that we can start from. Everything from the triggers that we were talking about, HTTP and timers, queue storage, service bus queue, which is a more advanced version of a queue, blob, event hub, Cosmos DB, IoT hub, an email that comes in, so if an email arrives through SendGrid, an event grid trigger, etc. Let's choose the timer trigger. So all functions must have a trigger and one trigger. Okay, so we've seen sort of an example list, but all functions must have a trigger. Now, very similar to the web job that we were creating, if you're going to do a timer trigger, then you're going to use cron syntax. In this case, remember, this is seconds and minutes. And so this this entry is on the 0 second every 5 minutes, essentially, right? So let's leave it as timer trigger 1, although it's not the best name. So I'll hit the create, and we'll see here that there's an editor right within the portal window. Okay, that's just like one option that we have. And this particular function, all it does is by default, it's just going to log the trigger function ran. Okay, doesn't actually do anything. Now we can go in here and we can start to write .NET code. You can recognize the using system and the public static void. So this is C# right within the browser window. We could obviously get it to do some other things. We can get it to create a blob. We can get it to call another URL, etc. Now, the way that we'll do that is through integrations, which are called bindings. So if I go, first I'll save this because I didn't enter. Go into the integration tab. And we can see that we have our timer trigger. We have no ability to create any more triggers. So every function must only have one trigger. It must have a trigger and it must only be one. We have the option to have data input with the trigger. So when the trigger runs, it can actually bring in, let's say we want to read a blob or read a database table, some type of input binding, and then there's an output binding. So let's say for this particular trigger, when it runs, I want to write a new blob file. So I chose an output binding and I chose Azure Blob Storage as one of the bindings. Now we can see here again, it's all WYSIWYG point and click, that we can have everything from queues. SendGrid is Azure's email provider, Twilio for SMS messages, Cosmos DB, lots of different options for output bindings. The bindings for inputs and outputs are going to be slightly different. Okay, so it's probably a good idea to go through, see all the triggers that you can have and various things that can be input and various things that can be output. So in this case, we want to write a blob when we get this URL, when we get this timer triggered. Now it does tell us the integration requires extensions, and it requires the storage extension. So obviously we're going to let that install a storage extension. It takes up to 2 minutes. On the same screen, we're going to set up our blob name. So this is going to basically be the variable that we can access this blob. We can define the path, and we have to basically have a connection string. So it's going to be called Azure Web Job Storage, or I can create a new one, right? This will show me how it uses the function. There's a built-in account key here, or I can create a brand new connection string and click Save. Okay, so I'm able to now access this outbound blob through the output blob binding. Okay, if we go back to the trigger, now the first thing we need to do at this point is to add our output blob as an output for this function. So we do that by adding a parameter that has an out keyword, and then we can say output blob. The reason we called it output blob is because that's the name that we gave it in the output binding. We called it output blob parameter name. So we do have to add that as a parameter. Okay. Now getting content into this blob is actually going to be pretty easy. We can now call output blob, because it's a string. We can call this within our code, and we can put some type of text here. This is going to be an extremely simple function, but all it's doing is it's creating a brand new blob with this content. Now, to remind you, the blob itself is going to be put into the storage account that's identified here using the out container and given a random name using this GUI ID. So let's go back to the function. Let's click run. Hey, why not? Now you'll see that we're running the code right within the browser. A console window pops up. We can see that the execution happened. C# timer trigger function executed. That code comes from our code. We have this output blob element, and then it executed successfully. Right? Very little output from it because our function only has the one line. Now, if we were to go to the storage account, we should see a blob that has some type of text here. So I'm going to go to my dashboard. I happen to know that this is the storage account that I use for functions. Go into blobs. Out container is the name of the container. And this last one that executed at 6 p.m. is our blob. What we can do is we can go into it and we can click download. And if I say show in container, you're going to see my downloads folder here. And if I open it, then it says some type of text here. So this blob was created with a GUI ID for a name, and it has some type of text here, and that's because our function, we basically defined the function to have that feature. So now you can use functions for way more advanced things than I've just set up. And remember, this is going to run every 5 minutes because we're running this on a timer. So every 5 minutes that file will get created randomly and put into that storage account until I disable it. So if I was to then go up here and say, you know what, don't need this running, then do that there. So functions are small pieces of code. Azure makes it very easy for you to create them even within the portal, but if you want to create it in your own environment, that's fine too. They're all self-contained, so that you've got your code and your function JSON all within the same directory here, and basically these are small pieces of code that will run inside of Azure. You don't need to, you attach it to your app service plan. In this particular case, if you want to use the consumption plan, you're just paying per execution. And so there you go.